Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
Few shows have left as deep a mark on American television as MASH. For 11 seasons, it made millions of viewers laugh 1 minute and cry the next, somehow finding comedy inside one of the darkest settings imaginable, a field hospital during the Korean War. It became more than a sitcom. It became a cultural touchstone, a show that changed how television talked about war, grief, friendship, and the absurdity of bureaucracy in the middle of chaos. But what a lot of fans don't fully realize is just how much turnover happened behind the camera. Cast members came and went, some quietly, some in ways that shocked the entire country. Today we're digging into why so many beloved actors chose to walk away from one of the most successful shows in television history, and what happened to them after the cameras stopped rolling. Some left because of creative frustration. Some left because the emotional weight of the role became too heavy to carry. And some left in ways that were so sudden, the writers had to scramble to explain it on screen. Let's get into it. Before we talk about who left and why, it helps to understand what made MASH such a strange and special project in the first place, because that context explains a lot about the tension that built up over the years. The story didn't start on television. It started as a novel written by a man named Richard Hornberger, who had actually served as a surgeon during the Korean War. He published his semi-autobiographical account under the pen name Richard Hooker in 1968, and the book found an audience almost immediately because it did something unusual. It combined dark, cynical humor with genuine horror. Readers weren't used to seeing war described that way, half stand-up routine, half trauma. Hollywood took notice, and just 2 years later, director Robert Altman turned the novel into a film. The movie version was loose, chaotic, and irreverent in a way that matched the mood of the country at the time, since the Vietnam War was actively dividing the nation. Audiences responded to the film's refusal to treat war as noble or clean, and it ended up winning major awards, including top honors at Cannes. That success is what convinced CBS to gamble on turning the concept into a weekly series. When the show premiered in the fall of 1972, it kept the wartime setting but reworked the tone. Instead of a purely satirical romp, the television version leaned into character development, letting audiences sit with these people week after week and actually get to know them. Alan Alda took on the role of Hawkeye Pierce, and it didn't take long for him to become the emotional and comedic center of the entire production. The first season had shaky ratings and nearly got canceled, but once the network moved it to a better time slot, the show found its audience and never looked back. Here's the thing though. As the series matured, it stopped being a simple ensemble comedy. It became something closer to a character study. And that shift in focus is exactly what caused friction among the cast. Some actors thrived under that new direction. Others felt like they were being pushed to the sidelines of a story they helped build. Over its 11-season run, the show would lose several of its most recognizable faces, and each departure tells its own story about ego, exhaustion, opportunity, and sometimes just plain bad luck. If you ask longtime fans which moment from MASH hit them the hardest, a huge number will point to the final scene of the Season 3 finale, an episode titled Abyssinia. Henry. It's a moment that's still talked about in television history classes because of how it broke the unwritten rules of sitcom storytelling. But to understand why that scene existed, you have to understand what was going on with the actor behind Colonel Henry Blake, a man named McLean Stevenson. From the very first episode, Stevenson played Blake as the fumbling, warm-hearted, slightly overwhelmed commanding officer of the unit. He wasn't sharp like Hawkeye, and he wasn't a schemer like some of the supporting cast. He was just a decent guy trying to keep things together in an impossible situation, and audiences loved him for it. His performance earned him major recognition early on, including a Golden Globe, and for a while it looked like Stevenson had one of the best jobs in television. But privately, he was growing restless. As the show evolved, more and more of the narrative weight shifted onto Alan Alda's shoulders. Alda wasn't just acting anymore. He was becoming deeply involved in writing and directing episodes, and that gave his character an increasingly central role in the show's identity. Stevenson, by contrast, felt like his character had plateaued. He wanted more, and he wasn't shy about saying so. In an interview around that time, he admitted that he wanted to be the guy carrying the show, not a supporting piece in someone else's story. It's easy to hear that and assume the man had an inflated ego, but that's probably too simple an explanation. Stevenson genuinely believed he had what it took to lead his own series, and being typecast as the bumbling colonel wasn't the legacy he wanted. So at the end of season 3, he told the producers he wouldn't be returning. Normally, a sitcom character in that position would get a soft exit. Maybe a transfer, maybe a promotion somewhere off-screen, the kind of departure that lets everyone move on without much emotional cost. But the writers saw an opportunity to do something the show had never done before. Remind the audience that this was still, underneath all the jokes, a story about a war. So they decided Henry Blake wouldn't just leave the unit. He would die on his way home. The final scene of Abyssinia, Henry, is still considered one of the most jarring moments in sitcom history. Radar walks into the operating room mid-surgery and delivers the news in a flat, devastating tone. Blake's plane went down over the Sea of Japan, and there were no survivors. No music swells to cushion the blow. No laugh track. Just silence and the sound of medical equipment. Most of the cast didn't know the twist was coming. Only the actor playing Radar had been let in on it ahead of time, which is part of why the shock on everyone else's faces looks so real. The public reaction was intense. CBS reportedly received a flood of mail, some from viewers who admired the show's honesty about wartime loss, and others furious that a character they loved had been ripped away without warning. The writers stood by the decision, arguing that the whole point was to remind people that in real wars, not everybody makes it home. As for Stevenson himself, the years that followed weren't kind to his ambitions. He landed a deal with NBC and starred in a sitcom built around his own persona, but it was canceled after a single season. A second attempt fared even worse and became something of a punchline in television circles. Years later, in an interview, he admitted with some regret that he had taken himself out of the game. It wasn't just that his new projects flopped. It was the growing realization that what he'd walked away from had been something rare, a combination of cast, writing, and cultural timing that doesn't come around twice. He continued picking up work here and there for the rest of his career, but he never found another role that resonated with audiences the way Henry Blake had. When he passed away in the mid-1990s, former colleagues remembered him warmly, describing him as a genuinely kind person, even if his exit from the show had come from a place of restlessness rather than conflict. If Stevenson's departure was loud and dramatic, Wayne Rogers' exit was almost the opposite, quiet, abrupt, and handled with almost no closure at all. One week his character was there, and the next he simply wasn't, with barely an explanation offered to the audience. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, one half of the original comic duo that anchored the show's earliest seasons. He and Hawkeye were basically a wartime version of two mischievous best friends, always finding trouble, always cracking wise, always leaning on each other to survive the absurdity around them. Audiences adored the pairing, and for a while, the show genuinely felt like it belonged to both of them equally. That equality didn't last. As the series went on, more of the story's emotional core started to orbit around Hawkeye specifically, partly because Alan Alda's growing creative involvement gave his character extra depth and screen time. Rogers, according to later interviews, hadn't signed up expecting that kind of imbalance. He joined thinking the show would function as a true ensemble, with the spotlight shared fairly across the main cast. Instead, he watched his character shrink from co-lead to something closer to a sidekick who reacted to whatever Hawkeye did. He once summed up his frustration by saying that Trapper had gone from being one of two equal buddies to the guy who nodded at everything. Rather than making a public fuss about it, Rogers chose to just leave. He didn't renew his contract after season 3, and reportedly the producers didn't even find out he was serious about leaving until shortly before production on the next season was set to begin. What made this even messier was a strange technicality. Rogers had apparently never formally signed a contract for the show. He'd essentially been working under a handshake agreement the entire time. So when producers considered legal action for breach of contract, they discovered there wasn't much of a contract to actually breach. The fallout on screen was noticeable. There was no goodbye scene, no emotional farewell, nothing to soften the blow for viewers who had just lost Henry Blake a season earlier and were now losing Trapper John too, with even less warning. The writers had to quickly patch together an explanation early in the next season, essentially stating that Trapper had already been discharged while Hawkeye happened to be away. It wasn't graceful, but it got the job done. Stepping into the gap left behind was a new character, B.J. Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell, who brought a steadier, more grounded energy than Trapper ever had. Interestingly, many critics and longtime fans now argue that the show actually deepened after this transition. The buddy comedy chaos of the early seasons gave way to a more introspective, emotionally layered version of the series, one that many consider superior to what came before. As for Rogers, his story afterward took an unusual turn. He didn't just fade into minor acting gigs. He pivoted almost entirely into finance, eventually becoming a well-known investor and financial commentator, appearing regularly on business television and building a reputation on Wall Street that had nothing to do with Hollywood. Despite the sudden and slightly messy nature of his exit, there doesn't appear to have been any lasting animosity between him and his former co-stars. Alda later spoke fondly of him, describing him as one of the smartest people he'd ever worked with. When Rogers passed away in 2015, tributes from the cast reflected genuine affection, a reminder that even an abrupt professional split doesn't have to mean a broken friendship. Not every departure from MASH was about ambition or creative frustration. Some were about something much more personal: burnout, mental health, and the simple need to reclaim a life that had been swallowed by a demanding production schedule. That was the case for Gary Berghoff, the actor behind Radar O'Reilly. Radar was, in a lot of ways, the emotional glue of the unit. He was young, sweet, a little naive, and had this almost supernatural ability to sense incoming helicopters before anyone else could hear them. Where Hawkeye and Trapper brought rebellion and BJ brought steadiness, Radar brought innocence, a reminder that not everyone in this war zone was hardened or cynical. Berghoff had actually played the character in the original film as well, making him the only actor to carry a role over from the movie into the series. And he used that continuity to deepen the character in ways the film never had room for. But by around season 7, the pressure of the role started catching up with him. The demanding shooting schedule, combined with what he later described as his own tendencies toward anxiety and depression, made the day-to-day grind of the production increasingly difficult to manage. Add to that the fact that he had a young daughter at home and was spending huge stretches of time away from her, and the emotional toll became something he couldn't ignore. He later said that missing those early years with his daughter felt like a mistake he never stopped regretting. There were also more practical disputes involved. Berghoff reportedly wanted better compensation and more flexibility, including less screen time, so he could actually have a life outside the studio. The production did try to accommodate him to some degree, granting him extra time off and trimming his appearances in later seasons, but it wasn't enough to keep him invested long-term. By season 8, he'd made up his mind. He was leaving. Unlike Rogers, though, Berghoff's departure was treated with real care by the writers. Radar got a 2-part farewell story, one of the most emotionally heavy arcs the show ever produced. In it, Radar comes home from leave only to find the unit falling apart without him, and after trying to fix everything the way he always had, he finally accepts that it's time to move on. His mother needs him, the family farm is struggling, and in a quiet way, the character has simply grown up. The final image of him walking away, silhouetted against the sky with his teddy bear left behind, remains one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire series. After leaving, Berghoff stepped back from the spotlight almost entirely. He tried a short-lived spin-off where his character became a small-town police officer, but it didn't find an audience. Eventually, he walked away from acting altogether, turning his attention toward painting, wildlife conservation, and even inventing. He reportedly held patents, including one related to fishing equipment. In his own words, he left for 2 reasons: family and burnout, and he wanted to put the pieces of his life back together. Today he lives a fairly private existence, rarely doing interviews, though fans occasionally spot him at conventions, still remembered fondly as the kid who could hear choppers before anyone else. Where some actors left because they felt overworked or underappreciated, Larry Linville left for a much simpler reason. He felt like his character had nowhere left to go. Linville played Major Frank Burns, the rigid, rule-obsessed, deeply insecure officer who served as the show's primary comic antagonist for its first several seasons. Burns was the kind of character audiences loved to root against. He was petty, he was hypocritical, he was carrying on a not-so-secret affair, and he had an inferiority complex that made him easy to mock. For a while, that dynamic worked perfectly, giving Hawkeye and the others someone to bounce their rebellious energy off of. The problem was that Frank Burns never evolved. While the rest of the ensemble was getting richer, more nuanced arcs as the show matured, Burns remained stuck exactly where he started, an easy punchline whose flaws never deepened into anything more complex. Linville, who by most accounts had far more range as an actor than the role allowed him to show, started to feel the limitations of playing a character frozen in place while everyone around him grew. By the end of season 5, he made his decision. He wouldn't be renewing his contract. He later explained that he'd simply taken a character as far as it could go. Nobody pushed him out, and there wasn't a dramatic falling out behind the scenes. He just recognized that the show had outgrown what Frank Burns was capable of offering. His exit ended up having a bigger creative impact than people might expect. With Burns gone, the writers no longer needed a one-dimensional villain to generate cheap laughs. That opened the door for the show to lean more into moral complexity and situational irony instead of slapstick cruelty. Something many fans and critics consider a turning point that helped elevate the series from good to genuinely great. On screen, Burns was quietly written out as having received an unexpected promotion, a low-key send-off that didn't try to manufacture emotion the show hadn't earned for that character. After MASH, Linville continued working steadily in guest roles across television and film, but he never landed another part with the same visibility as Frank Burns. Stepping into the vacancy his departure created was a very different kind of antagonist, one whose story deserves its own explanation. Not every notable cast change was about someone leaving. Sometimes it was about who arrived to fill the space left behind, and how differently that new presence chose to operate within the show. When Frank Burns exited, the producers needed someone to take his place as the resident source of friction, and they found that in David Ogden Stiers, who joined as Major Charles Emerson Winchester III. Winchester was built to be almost the opposite of Burns. Where Burns was petty and transparent, Winchester was cultured, sharp-witted, and genuinely brilliant, an aristocratic Boston surgeon who looked down on nearly everyone around him. He wasn't comic relief in the same cartoonish way Burns had been. He was a real obstacle, someone whose intelligence and pride made him a legitimate match for Hawkeye and BJ rather than an easy target. What made Stiers' performance so effective was the way he slowly peeled back Winchester's arrogance over time. He wasn't cruel underneath it all, just guarded, and maybe a little too proud to admit when he was struggling. Some of his most memorable scenes came from moments where his cultured exterior cracked just enough to reveal someone genuinely wrestling with the horror of war, even if he'd never say so directly. Unlike almost everyone else on this list, Stiers didn't leave the show early. He stayed all the way through to the final episode, and his send-off wasn't framed as a departure at all, but as a kind of closure. His last major scene, teaching a group of prisoners of war to play music together, is often cited as one of the most quietly beautiful moments in the entire series. When the producers later offered him a spot in the spin-off that followed the original show, he declined, explaining that Winchester's story had already said everything it needed to say.